Hello and welcome to Brockley News, Radio Brockley's weekly show with news, interviews and information, including updates on all you need to know about what's happening in and around the hospital. I'm Keith Reeve. Tonight we have an interview with Professor Steve Cannon MBE, who is now chairman of the SCAT Cancer Trust based here at the RNOH, but was also a surgeon and consultant here for many years. Then at 7:30 it's your chance to win some Radio Brockley goodies without leaving your bed on Bedside Bingo, and then at 8 o'clock it's your choice of tunes on the Sunday Request Show. So stay tuned to London's longest running hospital radio station, and once again the UK's official #1 hospital radio station, Radio Brockley. Today we are talking to a long-established friend and a serious contributor to the work here at the RNOH, helping reinforce the hospital's reputation as a centre of excellence, both in the field of orthopaedic and related oncological research and medicine. Welcome to Radio Brockley, Professor Steve Cannon, MBE.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Thank you for sparing your time for Radio Brockley.
It's a pleasure.
Now, many of our listeners will know you either as their consultant or possibly their surgeon. Either here, I understand also you were Edgware Hospital at one point. But tell us a little bit about how the young, newly qualified Dr. Cannon got on and got into the NHS. What were your experiences at the time and what made you decide to work in orthopaedics?
Well, Keith, as you imply, it's a very long story. I qualified from the Middlesex Hospital in London, which is sadly no longer with us, in 1974. Like many medical students, I hadn't done much practical work. I'd done a lot of theory, and I thought that surgery might be where I want to go. But I was really attracted to obstetrics and gynecology to start with. And then I decided that although I like babies, I wasn't quite so keen on ladies. So I decided that general surgery might be a better option. So I worked again at the Middlesex and various other hospitals around London, training essentially in general surgery, urology, all the general things which nowadays, to do orthopaedic surgery, you don't really have to do, which is probably in some ways a good thing and in other ways a very bad thing. So I was working very much in general surgery with very, very big cancers, intra-abdominal cancers, cancer of the pancreas, cancer of the esophagus, and the patients usually didn't do very well. And they still don't do that well compared to other forms of surgery. And then I was fortunate enough to discover orthopaedics at the Middlesex Hospital, and I fell in love with it. It's such a wonderful, wonderful occupation to be able to reconstruct someone, to take them out of pain, often almost instantaneously, and then allow them to mobilize and get back on their feet or get use of their arm very quickly indeed. So it was a very rewarding occupation. And then as my training evolved, I came here as what was then a senior registrar, and that was in, I think, 1981-82. That was the first time I had had the experience of Stanmore, and I fell in love with the place. I'd never worked anywhere like the RNOH, and it really was a fabulous place to come to. So here and again back at the Middlesex Hospital, where my training took me, I became exposed to malignancy or oncology of bone and joint and muscle, and I became absolutely bitten and striven by that particular problem, and I really wanted to work in that field. Fortunately, a gentleman who was very famous at the RNOH and indeed in Great Britain in 1987, a gentleman called Lord Trickey retired. But he was appointed both here and at Edgware General, which you mentioned before, and I was fortunate enough to gain his position. In those days it really was waiting for what we used to call dead men. We needed to wait for a job until someone retired. So I had 5 sessions at Edgware General, doing general orthopaedics, fractures, anything that walked through the door, and 5 sessions here. And the 5 sessions were dedicated to be Lord Trickey's, but although I was interested in tumours, we developed it for my interest to be both knee surgery and malignant surgery. And that was in 1987. When I came, it was a very different place to what it is now. We just had 2 operating theatres. There were no interconnecting corridors to all the outbuildings and outpatients. Everything was open air.
I remember that very well. Yeah.
And the most impressive thing that I found is that many of my adolescent patients used to come down from Zachary Merton in a horse box.
Yeah.
In the back of a horse box, clean horse box, but a horse box nonetheless. And that was really very primitive. Everyone at that time knew it was very primitive in terms of its environment, and people were dedicated to try and get a new hospital. When I was appointed in 1987, they told me that I'd have a new hospital in 3 years. So this year is a very important day for me to see that the new inpatient facility opened this year. So it's a marvellous achievement for all those that have carried on the work to try and accomplish this, and it's no more than the RNOH deserves.
Absolutely. 2018 is a milestone year for the RNOH. It was for the first time at Stanmore we're going to have a building housing wards on more than one level. Certainly since the old nursing home was the main hub of the hospital 100 years ago.
Yes, and I think the designers have to be congratulated because it's still below the tree line. And I think, we haven't ruined the sort of country feel to the environment that will continue to exist. Yeah. And I think that sort of countryness and freshness of the environment is a very, very important structure.
I agree. I've seen, since my longest in stay as a patient, which was 1972, it used to be much more wooded then than it is now, and it was a joy to get off the ward into some woodland, little ponds, frogs skimming across the water on a summer's day. Total escapism. You can't put a price on that for rehabilitation and what have you. So we're kind of moving on to this, really. What are your fondest memories of the RNOH?
Well, I think we've talked about the rather poor quality environment that we came to, but that generated, I think, Keith, a sort of, I used to call it the Dunkirk spirit. You were fighting against the odds, and that kept a very special camaraderie amongst the people that were working here. It wasn't a large staff, and that was often the problem that we had in trying to get a new hospital, but it was relatively small. But it was a time when you knew everyone, and everyone knew who you were, and therefore you didn't walk past people in the corridor without saying hello. You didn't stop, but you smiled, you recognised, you greeted them with the time of day, and they did likewise to you. So it was a very friendly environment, and people soon became very, very enamoured of it, and our staff stayed. Once they got over the shock of coming, they stayed here for a long, long time. And it's that friendship and camaraderie that developed over the years, that really is the joy to remember. I have not worked now here for 3 years, so I don't know whether it's still the same, but it's certainly a lot busier. There's a lot of people I don't know now, but I've just had a very wonderful walk around the hospital, and people who do remember me coming up and saying hello and giving me a hug. And that's just the girls.
That's good to know. It's lovely to know that you're remembered as well by so many people for all the work you've done here, and that's good to know. I think there is, as you say, a definite spirit at Stanmore that we hope to be able to move on into our future developments and the rebuild of the hospital as it moves forward. Now, you're also known in many other roles associated with difficult orthopaedic and oncological problems. How far has the NHS contributed to advances in those fields, and how far is this work reliant on charity and commercial or private funding?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and to put a percentage on it would actually be quite difficult. But certainly the NHS provides us with a wonderful opportunity to get specialist surgery performed in a specialist area. So the structure of the NHS allows us to take those difficult problems from other surgeons and other areas where they wouldn't be able to deal with it. So the structure of the NHS allows us to be a specialist hospital. I could moan on about the funding of that and how underfunded it is in what is called tariff. which is very, very important to us to survival. But in other words, they have to really give us what it's worth, otherwise we're working in debt all the time. So the NHS has certainly provided a very good structure. It is, like most of the NHS, underfunded. If it was better funded, we could do more. But as regards advances, most of those advances have come from two sources. Source number one, which is one of the joys of the orthopaedic area, is University of London, University College, the Department of Biomedical Engineering, and we in the oncology department worked more closely with them than any other department. So we have brought on the techniques involved in these massive endoprostheses in all areas of the body with the help of engineering funding, some of it national funding, but not necessarily the NHS, some of it private, to make a change and make a step difference in reconstruction. We've also tapped ourselves, and BME have tapped, BME is biomedical engineering, tapped private resources to fund the research involved to take things off the ground. And we're very grateful for that. And also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, SCAT has also provided funding for these advances. So quite a significant proportion has been privately funded.
And UCL and the biometric engineering, as you say, have got long-standing bases here at Stanmore, where that work goes hand in hand with the day-to-day activities of the hospital.
That was one of the great attractions of coming here in the late 80s, to work alongside engineers. Engineers are very good designers. They're very good. They sometimes forget that you've got to get it in, which is a problem that we discuss with them. But we've worked very, very closely with them in the design and structure of prostheses, which have advanced not only the United Kingdom, but also Europe and the rest of the world, where our prostheses are exported to.
We do a good business there, I think, with the work we do here in advancing that technology. So, under your watch, how has orthopaedic oncology evolved, and what are the next steps? You've just kind of alluded to some of that in the developments in prosthetic appliances, but what else is happening?
So if we go back to the middle 80s, when I was appointed, chemotherapy for these malignancies was in its infancy. And therefore, because we developed with our colleagues in University College Hospital and other hospitals both in this country and in Europe, effective chemotherapy. And one of the most important things that we've been involved in is so-called trials to see which dose and which chemotherapy agent is best for which particular tumour. There's a variety of tumours. So that has been a great advance to get good response to chemotherapy. And if you get good response to chemotherapy, then you can usually resect, that means remove the tumour and reconstruct the limb or the pelvis, if need be, which you couldn't do if the chemotherapy hadn't worked. If you go back historically to just a bit further than the early 80s to the late 70s, the vast majority of tumours in the limbs were treated by amputation. So we reversed that completely in our period of working here, from about 90% having amputations to less than 10% having to have an amputation.
That's amazing.
So it's an amazing switch. Unfortunately, chemotherapy is still now in a rut, shall we say. It has got to make the next step to get those other 10% into treatment. But it will come, and we're very much, I think, making progress in what I call individualised treatment of various cancers, which certainly our histopathology department here is working very hard to do.
Another Stanmore Centre of Excellence.
Another Stanmore Centre of Excellence.
So as well as your surgical and research work, you've also been involved in various campaigns. How did all that come about?
I would like to say the statement, if you need something doing, ask a busy man, it probably did apply to me. Not so much now, but in those days, if people asked you something and you thought it was a good idea, then you would try very hard to do your best to do it. Most of my work has been very much in that regard, has not been about specific campaigns, but But certainly the charity here, SCAT, which again we'll talk about, it has been a very, very important part of my life. But also being involved in the British Orthopaedic Association and developing education and ongoing education, particularly for consultants in this country in orthopaedics, has been very dear to my heart. And then as a step on from that, the Royal College of Surgeons, where I was vice president, where a whole host of problems in terms of structure of surgery came up. And I also worked as president for an organisation called EFORT, which is a European body of orthopaedic associations, to again try and develop essentially education and training of orthopaedic surgeons across Europe. I think it's one of the great problems we have, in that if you have an orthopaedic surgeon from Italy coming to work in the UK, we assume he's the same quality as an orthopaedic surgeon trained in this country. Now, that's not been in any way disregarding of the talents of Italians, but it could be Romanians, it could be Czechs, it could be anyone. And I think an approach to absolutely level out the playing field of education across Europe would be something that I've worked very hard for. It's ongoing. We have achieved a little, but it's never easy.
Do you think politics gets in the way there?
Politics certainly gets in the way, and individualism certainly gets in the way. It's often very difficult to negotiate with the French or the Germans. I found the Spanish are relatively easy. The Swedes are very easy, and the Dutch are our best ally.
Now, in addition to being a surgeon, a consultant, a researcher and a professor, what do you do in your spare time? You received an MBE for your work. That must have been an amazing moment in your life. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you. It was a wonderful honour to be recognised by Her Majesty and indeed the government, because it is actually a governmental honour, and the Queen just gives you the medal, which is wonderful. So the citation was for services to orthopaedics and SCAT, the Skeletal Cancer Action Trust. And again, we'll come on to talk about SCAT, which is dear to my heart, and I want people to know about it. But it resulted in a beautiful October morning going to Windsor Castle. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was Her Majesty herself who presented me with the MBE. It's a wonderful experience. The first thing you notice is that she's very much smaller than you think she is. And she was standing on a dais, and when I walked in front, I was still a lot taller than she was. So she was looking up at me and I was looking down at her. And she said a sentence to me and I replied, and then she said another sentence and I replied, and then she indicated that was the end of our interview. So I had a step backwards and a bow, and off I went again. But we had a wonderful day of celebration with my friends and family, and it was a marvellous memory. And
very well deserved, I would say.
Well, obviously, I don't think anyone came up to me and said, you didn't deserve that. So perhaps it was.
I'm sure they wouldn't dare. Now, looking at the future of the NHS, and with a nod to the development of the RNOH here at Stanmore, if you could choose to influence the government with regards to healthcare here at the RNOH or nationally or in one specific area, what would be your area?
Well, I think like most doctors who worked in the NHS, we would really say it is really a matter of funding. You can try and influence certain specific areas, but I remember being here. We had to fight daily for an ITU bed. It's silly, really, that you have to go through this rigmarole and disappoint patients because you can't get a bed and send them away, even though they've got cancer, to come back another week or another day. And that's really terrible. It is really a matter of funding it properly. Now, I've had the great opportunity to go around the world and look at other people's ways in which they fund it. We have a wonderful service which is the envy of the world in terms of access free at the point of delivery, and I would not want to alter that in any way whatsoever. But with an ageing population, and we are, and I hope I'm going to see my 90s, my father did and my grandfather did, so hopefully I will, people will get particularly musculoskeletal disease. So we have to be at the forefront at this hospital of treating people who have these problems, who have problems related to the treatment they've had before, which is going to be very important.
It gets very complex, doesn't it?
And it gets very complex indeed. And we have to come to an agreement on how we should fund it. I think we're all agreed as well that direct taxation is not going to be the answer. So we have to look at various funding models. While it's in the hands of the government, they are not going to vote for any change because they'll be voted out at the next general election. So you need a cross-party working party or a cross-party royal commission to actually sort out how it should be done. I don't want to bore you with the methods that would actually be suitable, but Europe, France, Luxembourg, Spain all spend much more of their GDP on health and have a good service and lots of hospital beds, lots of doctors, where we do not. And we struggle in terms of numbers of doctors, and results are portrait for that. I mean, it doesn't take much thought to realise that we are bottom of certain tables, that we could improve that by doing a few things. But it is funding, and we need to work very hard on that.
Quite agree, I think. From all the other people I talked to and interviewed, they say a similar thing. So, yeah, on the right lines, I think. So tell us a little bit about the work of SCAT, Bone Cancer Trust, which you're a chairman of. And obviously during this chat, we've mentioned it a few times. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, it is a very, very interesting charity. It's based here at the RNOH to serve RNOH patients. Again, if you go back historically, it was developed as what was called a WIG fund. And if we come back to the late 70s, early 80s, when I was just becoming involved, children would have very toxic chemotherapy because of their cancer and would lose all their hair. And in those days, the NHS only provided you with a wig that was, shall we say, obviously a wig and looked a bit like a mop upside down. And at that time, there were various fashions. One was Tina Turner, the other was Sinead O'Connor. So you could either do the shave, or which didn't need any funding apart from the hire of a razor, or you could buy a really expensive red lemon wig to wear over. And people thought, as the child was like any other child. And this was fabulous and a great step forward for them. A very simple thing, but it was relying just on donations. There was no active commitment to it. And then again in the early 90s, we decided to try and up the ante of this charity, and also appointed a fundraiser so that we could work very much on getting funds by various means, events. Patients again being involved and doing things to bring in money to try and support essentially research, and we can talk a little bit about research, but also articles that would help the patient in rehabilitation and support groups. And that's essentially the area that we're in. We have a subset of projects within it which we call Live Life to the Full, which has actually been very successful. What that did was to take, you remember, the 9% of patients who had amputations, and try, particularly in children, to offer them a state-of-the-art prosthesis. That is, a prosthesis that they could run in, or prosthesis they could walk quickly in, rather than the old-fashioned NHS prosthesis. And so we initially provided patients with these prostheses, which was very expensive. Unfortunately, we don't have the funds to keep doing it for every patient, but we now kickstart. We give them a grant to get some money themselves to do it if need be. But essentially, our pressurising of government with these patients, showing them how well they are doing, has led to the government now also agreeing. So that area of our support is now diminishing, and we will have to find and direct our work to some other area. One of the areas that we're thinking of really working hard on is what I term the cost of survival, because obviously patients who come through very high dose chemotherapy have had major surgery often even involving prostheses, they're not quite the same as they were when they started. And some of these have very, very difficult social, schooling and family problems. And I think we need to work hard on that as well. It's easy to just forget them because they've survived, but it's not. They have ongoing problems that we need to really help with. So certainly we're thinking about working towards that. And I know one of our more recent appointments, Mr. Craig Durand, is working very hard in that area.
That's good to know. And I'm just trying to work out how long SCAT as a charity has been going. Because you alluded to the Whig Fund there in the late 70s, so that's sort of 40 years or so.
Yes.
So it must be about that long, I'm guessing.
I can't honestly tell you when we changed from the Whig Fund, and that's what it was called, and we changed the bank account to Skeletal Cancer Action Trust, or SCAT.
I'm sure at some point in the past at an event here I bought a sweatshirt with SCAT on, and that must be about 30 years ago.
I think you're right. I think it was around the late 80s, probably.
I would put it
late
about
80s,
there,
that's 1988, 2018. About 30 years is about right.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Professor Steve Cannon MBE, thank you very much for joining us today. And we echo the words of the chairman of the RNOH, Professor Anthony Goldstone, who said that we are proud to have you as an alumni, and that the MBE awarded to you is nothing less than a recognition of everything you have done for the hospital and the SCAT charity. So thank you very much.
Keith, thank you very much, and thank you, the RNOH.
Don't forget you can listen again to Brockley News by following the links from our website at www.radiobrockley.org. And you can now tune in to Brockley News Extra 5 days a week at midday for another chance to hear some of our recent interviews, and again on Monday nights at 8 p.m. And if there's anything else you want to find out about the activities taking place here in the hospital, then do get in contact with us on extension 5483 or on 020 8954 6591, and we'll try to cover it in a future edition of Brockley News. Up next on Radio Brockley, it's Bedside Bingo, your chance to win some Radio Brockley goodies, and then at 8 p.m, it's all your requests on the Sunday Request Show. Brockley News returns at the same time next week, but from me, Keith Reeve, it's good night.